we get started with today's agenda and get crack-a-lacking on the stuff in the agenda, being a 60-minute class instead of a 70 whatever minute class, I have no idea really how far we're going to get. It sort of depends. When we get into Civil War stuff and people start asking me questions, it slows me down a lot. So I almost never get done what I think I'm going to get done. But I think that we'll get through strengths and weaknesses of both sides. I think we'll get through the strategy. Anybody want to take a shot? I know you know the answer to it, but what does a strategy mean? In fact, I think we've had this vocab term before that we've tried to define.
A plan for something.
A plan for something. And since we're talking about the Civil War, you got to figure both sides, the Union, United States of America, and the Confederacy or Confederate States of America, have to have a plan or a strategy to win the war. So we'll take a look at the differences between those two strategies. Anytime you've played a sport, your coach has a strategy to defeat the other team. If it's football in high school, Coach Sokup has watched the other team probably on tape 4 or 5 times before they actually play them. So he knows where their strengths and weaknesses are. Again, that goes back to the first thing that we'll be covering today, some of the strengths and weaknesses of the Union and the Confederacy. So you have to take advantage of the enemy's weaknesses while trying to nullify or stop the enemy's strengths. That's how you create a strategy. Same thing would be true in a basketball game. Same thing would be true in a wrestling match. So if I'm coaching you against someone that I've seen you wrestle before, we're going to come up with a strategy that's going to allow you to take advantage of their weaknesses. So that's where we're going to get both show. We might get to the first real battle of the Civil War. We could have called Fort Sumter a battle, but it really wasn't, because how many people died in the Battle of Fort Sumter? 0. And then a couple died afterward as a result of some silliness, really. I guess it was a good attempt at trying to waste some Confederate or what was going to become Confederate cannonballs, but that's the plan. If we don't get to the first bull run, we don't get there. If we get there, boo, y'all, we're right on track with where I really would like to be. So we'll see. And I'm not sure, 100% sure, but I think next week is the last week of the quarter. Does anybody know that for sure?
Yeah.
So Friday, and then we go on spring break after that. The reality is I'm not really sure if we're going to get to the point where we'll be ready for any kind of a quiz or anything in between now and then, which is fine as long as you're happy with the grades that you have. But if there's something that's missing in your grades or it's not what you want it to be, there's not too many opportunities left to increase or improve your grade. So stay on top of double checking to make sure that you have everything done that you're supposed to have done. I think yesterday I went in and updated everything I had. So if you did something after third block yesterday, then it might not be updated. And if that's the case, I'll go in and check again and again and again. But it should be, my end should be accurate. So if it says 0, you're going to show me that you did it. I won't call you a liar until you can't show me that you did it. And then when you show me, I'll be like, okay, I'll fix it. So double check your grades, stay on top of that stuff. Yes, sir. No, eventually I'll change it here, complete to a 0 if you never show me your study guide.
Oh, I can still do it.
Will probably be a good idea.
I didn't think that you could do them after the time that it was.
Well, you don't want it complete, do you? No, then you should probably do it. So, do you guys remember when we got to, did we get here?
Yeah.
The idea that both sides believed the war was going to be really short, like a 90-day enlistment, that's almost comical for a war. And the Civil War is going to be really big, but both sides thought it was going to turn into a big nothing sandwich. 90 days, holy cow. If you were to enlist in the Army today, probably going to spend 2 months just getting you through basic training, and then you might go to a specialist school or something where you learn how to do other stuff. So you might spend 3 months in the military just learning to go fight before you're sent to fight, which tells us that of these 75,000 men, we can make some assumptions without knowing anything more about the war. Either it was just plain assumed that the war would be over within 90 days, or it was assumed that those 90 or those 75,000 men are going to show up. We're going to hand them muskets or rifles. Rifles actually exist by the time of the Civil War, and we're going to send them into the battle with very little or maybe even no training. So, a lot of misunderstandings or misconceptions about the length of the war. With the newspaper guy saying he would eat all the bodies of those that die as a result of this war, that doesn't mean the guy was a hungry cannibal. It just means he thought there weren't going to be any. That we can talk our way through this. If you're a Charleston newspaper editor, I'm sure you're a Confederate, which also means that you probably believe the Union is just going to allow those Confederate states to break away and be their own country. U.S. Senator Chestnut, I'll drink all the blood. He's not a vampire, at least I don't think. If James Chestnut was a vampire and wanted to drink a lot of blood, then Abraham Lincoln would have killed him, because Abraham Lincoln was a vampire hunter. Just kidding. Somebody needs to read that book so they'll know what the heck I'm talking about. So, we're going to split this up a little bit. To start to prepare for a war that this will become, both sides are looking for a head honcho, a leading man. And the Union starts out going after the best that they can see. They decide, Abraham Lincoln sends his Secretary of War, a man named Edwin Stanton, to go find Robert E. Lee, who was a Union general. Remember, Robert E. Lee was the guy that put down the rebellion at Harper's Ferry. He's the guy that captured John Brown. He's the guy that stopped that. So he's Lincoln's go-to guy. So Edwin Stanton goes to Robert E. Lee and he says, Mr. Lee, we would really appreciate it, Abraham Lincoln would really appreciate it if you would take command of the Army of the Potomac, the biggest, strongest, bestest of the Union armies. They offer command of all of the Union armies to Robert E. Lee. He's the best Union general. Robert E. Lee decides to deny the request. Lee says, sir, I really appreciate it, and this is just paraphrasing because I don't have a quote for it. I really appreciate the honor that you're asking me to lead the Union Army, but sir, I have to decline it because I'm a Virginian. So all these people have to make a decision. Is your loyalty to the United States? All of these soldiers who, when you become a soldier, you swear an oath of loyalty to the United States. In fact, every morning we stand up and put our hand on our hearts and we recite an oath of loyalty to the United States in the form of the Pledge of Allegiance. And most of us are loyal to the United States. But the question comes up in the Civil War, are you an American first or are you a Virginian first? And for Robert E. Lee, his decision was, I'm a Virginian. So he'll ultimately take control of the Confederates' biggest army, the Army of Northern Virginia. Here's the thing about Lee that a lot of people don't understand. Again, we make that assumption that if you're going to support the Confederacy, you must love slaves. Robert E. Lee hated the idea of slavery. So, is that more evidence to support my assumption or my conclusion that the Civil War isn't just about slavery? If the guy that's going to lead the Confederate Army doesn't like slavery, he thinks it's a bad thing. But he takes command because he is a Virginian. That's his priority, is Virginia. He loves his state, therefore he has to love the group that his state supports. We also have more evidence here, and I'll show you in a map in a minute, and most of you caught this when we had class earlier with that orange and red map. I think it was in chapter 15 still, when the states began to secede. We have 5 states that we're going to call border states because they're on the border between the Union and Confederacy. Those 5 border states are slave states that remained loyal to Abraham Lincoln. So Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And then West Virginia, I think, is 54 counties in the western part of Virginia. I'm not sure if it's 54 or 42. I don't know the number, but I'm pretty close. 54 counties said, hey, we don't want to secede. So those 54 counties broke away from Virginia so they could remain loyal to the Union while Virginia was secesh. They had seceded. They become secesh. So lots of words that are new to us. Secesh, secession, secede. They all kind of mean the same thing. So West Virginia becomes a state as a result. And it's kind of cool because if you look at Virginia before the Civil War, it sort of looks like a state that's ready to have a baby. And then West Virginia is born. Virginia's kind of got a big belly, and then boom, here's West Virginia. So those border states are kind of important. And at some point, I'm going to quiz you over what are the 5 border states and why are they loyal to the Union. Again, maybe it's not just an issue of slavery. Even if it is an issue of slavery, and you're a slave state, and by the way, do you suppose most of the people in these 5 border states were slave owners, or do you suppose some of the people were slave owners? Most or some? Some. Most were probably not slave owners. Here's the thing. Let's just say we have a contest, and you have to pick your favorite teacher. We all know that I'm your favorite teacher, but you also know that in your mind, if you pick Mr. Zurich, maybe he'll give you less homework. Are you guys Zurich or Castro? Castro. So if you pick Mrs. Castro, maybe she'll like you better and give you less homework. So might there be a benefit? Yeah, she's still going to give you a mountain of homework because she hates every human. She does. She just loves math. Humans don't matter to her. Social studies teachers love everyone.
That's why.
Yeah.
She is nice.
No, she's not.
She's evil.
She's mean, evil.
Okay, but it's really
mathy.
hard to not. It's really hard to not give math homework and math.
How? You just say, yeah, you guys don't need to know this. I'm just teasing. I love Mrs. Castro's class. Math is hard. So, do you think that there's some sort of benefit that Missouri might get by staying loyal to the Union? Do you think that there's some states, maybe, and this might be a stretch, that are thinking, if there really is going to be a war, and that's still a little bit of a question mark, even after Fort Sumter, if there's really going to be a war, I want to be on the side that's going to win. Because if I'm the side that's going to win, I'm going to benefit from it. And that guy, Abraham Lincoln, he's promising not to mess with slavery, so if we have some slaves, and he's promised not to mess with them, and we remain loyal, that's kind of important. Our loyalty might be rewarded later on. So as long as you announce, yes, Mr. Bellamy, you are my favorite class, all right, then we're not going to have as much homework because why would I be mean to the people that love my class? That just doesn't make any sense at all. So when we look at a map of those border states, this is critically important. And I know I'm going to shrink my Zoom people just because, sorry, Zoom people. If you have a question, you're going to have to, I'll turn my volume on. You're going to have to scream because I'm not going to see you. I'm shrinking you to very small so that my map's more visible. You can see slave states are all gray, and you can see the pink line is the line that differentiates the Confederacy with the Union. Now, I'm going to come back to this in just a minute. I think there's one more map that's going to help us out. Territories are light blue, and free states are dark blue. So we've got Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, formed in 1863. So at the time we're talking about right now, West Virginia doesn't exist, but it's GNU, Maryland, and Delaware. Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. They're gray. They're slave states, but they remain loyal to the Union. Maybe they just wanted to be on the bandwagon of the side they thought was going to win. I don't think that's necessarily the case, because 2 years into the war, it doesn't necessarily look like the Union's going to win. That's a little bit of a preview for you. I thought I had one more really good map of that. I must not. So anyway, let's look very carefully here, and unfortunately it doesn't show up. But does anybody remember, geographically, what state do we find Washington, D.C. in? Trick question.
Oregon. Maryland.
Okay, so someone over here said Virginia, and Riley said Maryland. And the correct answer is neither.
Washington, D.C.?
Washington, D.C. isn't in a state. It's separate from the states.
Isn't it up like
So when Washington, D.C. was created, what they did is took 10 square miles of land away from Virginia and Maryland and sandwiched it in between. So Washington, D.C. isn't in a state. If they put it in a state, what do the other states think? That's not fair.
So it's basically like asking if the Missouri River is in Iowa or Nebraska.
Right, it's not. It's both. It's none. It's neither. It's all. So Washington, D.C. isn't in a state. But look at the location of Washington, D.C. right here on the Potomac River. Can you see my cursor right here? If I do this, sometimes it gets big. I don't know. It's not right now. You see my cursor right there? That's where Washington, D.C. is located. Any issues with our border states here? Or potential issues with the border states? Cursor. Washington, D.C. is surrounded by slave states. What happens if Maryland, a border state, a slave state that remains loyal, what happens if Maryland decides to secede and join the Confederacy? Where's the capital of the United States located? Either got a lot of students that don't get it or you're just shy today. Help me out here or this is going to be a really long class. If Maryland decides to secede, where's the capital of the United States located? It's not in a state.
Oh, it'll be just part of the free.
This is Washington, D.C. Maryland is slave. Virginia is slave, but Maryland stays loyal. What if Maryland decides to go into the Confederacy? Where's the capital of the United States located? In the Confederacy. How's that work? Would you put the capital of the United States in Mexico? That wouldn't make any sense at all to have the capital of your country in another country. So, does Abraham Lincoln have to be a little bit cautious about potentially ticking off those border states? If he loses them, they don't have huge populations, but we've got to move the capital of the United States if that's the case, because it's already on the border of the enemy, which is a little dangerous. And they had backup plans for that. What are we going to do if Maryland falls to the Confederacy? Well, they're going to move the capital to New York. So they knew what they were going to do. All right, this kind of skips out of order a little bit, but that's okay. This is Robert E. Lee. This is the guy that was asked to run the Union Army, but turned it down. And he's going to pay a pretty heavy price for this. By the way, the horse that he's riding on, Robert E. Lee was a Southern gentleman. He had lots of money and he had lots of horses. This is his favorite horse. This horse's name is Traveler. I believe when Traveler died, Robert E. Lee actually had him stuffed, which I think is weird that you stuff a pet. I have actually kind of a funny story. It came up on how many of you have Facebook? You cannot be ashamed to say you have Facebook, because a few years ago nobody would admit to that because they're like, that's for old people. But now more younger people are starting to use it. So I like to post things in Facebook once in a while because when they pop up in my memories, it's kind of cool to see what happened 5 years ago. And I see pictures of what my kids look like 5 years ago or 7 years ago or 10. So there was one that popped up this weekend. It was from 10 years ago. Now, we had a fish. Taryn had a goldfish named Clifford. Have I ever told you the Clifford story before? Okay. He started out as one of those 15-cent goldfish. I think she won him at Gateway to the West days when you throw a ping pong ball in. You know what I'm talking about? So she comes home with this little goldfish, and we started with a little tiny aquarium. And pretty soon we got a little bit bigger aquarium, and Clifford kept growing. Clifford because of the big red dog. He was orange, but for some reason Taryn named him Clifford. And he'd grow a little bit, so we'd buy the next bigger tank. Pretty soon we've got a gigantic 27-gallon aquarium for Clifford and some friends. So we got some more fish. Anyway, Clifford got to be probably 6 inches long. He was gigantic. And dirty goldfish are dirty. They poop a lot, so they fill up your filter with gunk, and it's pretty gross.
And you're using this
Anyway, one day Clifford dies. 10 years ago. So Taryn is 15 and 10 and actually turns 13 tomorrow. So he would have been 3 and Taryn would have been 5-ish. So when a fish dies and you have little kids, what do you do with the dead fish? You flush it. So we have a little fish funeral because this was Taryn's pet, so she's always been a little sensitive anyway, so she's sad, and I'm like, it's okay, we'll flush Clifford, and we'll have a little funeral. So it's me and Taryn and Tannen standing in the bathroom, and we're all standing there, and Taryn's like, what do we do, Dad? And I'm like, well, before we flush Clifford, maybe you should say a little prayer. So Taryn says a cute little 5-year-old prayer, probably more like her bedtime prayer that she used to say. And it was kind of cute, and I said, okay, Tannen, would you like to say anything? Thinking, what kind of prayer is a 3-year-old going to come up with? And maybe it's bedtime prayer or something like that. Yeah, no. Dude does the Pledge of Allegiance. So at Clifford's funeral, my 3-year-old Tannen's got his Pledge Allegiance to the flag. I guess that was appropriate, So then, unfortunately, whoosh, you try flushing a 6-inch fish. This was probably one of the dumbest things I've ever did. Yeah, he was rather stiff, and he didn't make it around the turns of the toilet pipe, so he clogged it up, and I probably spent an hour plunging Clifford to go down the drain and out into the septic tank. But it was rather interesting, and it would have been good to have. But I have the Facebook memory because I posted that we were having a fish funeral and the story that I just told. And I look back on that, and I had no memory of Tannen doing the Pledge of Allegiance for a fish funeral when he was 3 until Facebook reminded me that I did. So Facebook maybe becomes our new history book for those of us that post nice things on it and not just mean things. But anyway, that's his horse Traveler. Robert E. Lee was kind of an odd dude too, and there's lots of stories that I can tell you about him too. But at one point, he's full battle mode, so the Civil War's full on raging, and he's hanging out in his tent, he's getting ready to go to bed. And when you're the general, not like the general from the Shaquille O'Neal insurance commercials, but the man for the Confederacy. So we're going to learn about this guy as almost as if he's a good guy, but he's on the wrong side of this war. Still an American. And the best general of the Civil War, maybe second best, we'll see. I'll let you decide that later on. But he's laying in his bed when all of a sudden he hears a kind of a rustling noise underneath his cot. So it's kind of probably dark, and he gets his lantern and he looks underneath his cot, and there's a chicken. And Robert E. Lee's like, what the heck? Well, that day, the Confederate Army, this is right after, I think it's maybe around the time of the Battle of Gettysburg or Chancellorsville. It was a little bit before that. They had received a shipment of live chickens to feed the army. It takes a lot of food to feed an army of 80,000 men, which is probably about the average that Robert E. Lee had in his army at any given time, which is huge. And that's not the only army. That's just the Army of Northern Virginia. And one of the chickens escaped from its cage and ran into Lee's tent. Nobody saw it. So Lee grabbed this chicken and turned it into a pet. He named her. His chicken, Robert E. Lee had a pet horse named Traveler. He had a pet chicken. You'll like this. This is actually a rather good quality name. Nellie the War Chicken. That was her name. So Robert E. Lee would come home every night or come back from battle and go into his tent. And there would be Nellie the War Chicken, and he would lift up his bunk, and Nellie the War Chicken nearly every day for almost 2 years laid him an egg. What's the benefit of that? Lee's having breakfast every day. Not everyone had access to that. So Nellie was, and he'd feed her scraps, food and the bits of corn and stuff that he would find in places. And if anybody gets to eat, it's the general anyway. But Lee, being a good general, he didn't really like to, show off in front of his men that he had all sorts of food, and they were probably going a little bit hungry. So Nellie laid him an egg. After 2 years, she'd slowed down a little bit, and this story's kind of getting ahead of itself, but there was a black man in the Confederate Army that was assigned to serve Lee. So he was kind of like the cook. And if Lee needed anything, he was his gopher. So go do this, and the guy would go do it. Not a slave, but he was just assigned to take care of the basic needs of the general. So one day Lee says to this guy, he goes, "Hey, tonight for dinner, can you mix up something good? Because a couple other officers are going to come over." Now, at this time, this is late in the war, so provisions, food is pretty scarce. So this black man, the fact that he was black really doesn't make any difference in the story other than the fact that he wasn't a slave. He's looking around and he's trying to figure out, what am I going to cook for these guys? And then he looks over and sees Nellie the war chicken.
What?
So that night they sit down for dinner and General Lee is like, "Wow, this is delicious. You cook a fine chicken." And I can't remember what the guy's name was that was cooking it. And the other three guys are like, "No, that was great," because they probably weren't getting very much good fried chicken at the time. And Lee all of a sudden comes to a realization that, where did you get a chicken this late in the war when there aren't any chickens? And he realizes it was Nellie that he had just eaten. Probably tougher than an old rubber boot. But the thing is, if you're hungry, you'll probably eat about anything. There was actually one story, and I don't know how true this would be, where Lee was getting ready to retreat after defeat at the Battle of Gettysburg, and he couldn't find his chicken. So for a very brief amount of time, he delayed retreat while people were looking for Nellie. That's crazy to imagine that that could possibly be true.
Do you think he actually took his chicken to war?
Well, like not into battle, but from camp to camp. So yeah, that's crazy to think. I mean, you'd think a dog maybe would be a good animal to take off to camp with you. And lots of people had pet dogs. Maybe like a goldfish would be kind of difficult because they'd slosh around too much. But yeah, I don't know. A chicken, a good pet, loyalty from a chicken, I don't know. The cat, well, cats would be good because they can survive on their own. So anyway, when we look at a little bit of background on Lee, he's the son of a Revolutionary War general. So he's got military in his blood. There's a pedigree there that tells us he knows how to fight. He graduated from West Point Military Academy in 1829, second out of 46. Now, when you graduate second out of 46, a lot of things come into play at a military academy. Grades are part of it. When you graduate high school, there will be a list basically that tells you what level you graduate. If you graduate top of the class, you're number one. You're number one in the class, and it'll list you're number 15 or you're in the top 10%. They'll kind of give you an idea where you're at. And you guys can probably guess within a reasonable guess who's going to finish number one in the 8th grade class when you graduate as seniors. You probably can list 4 or 5 students that you know are just way amazing students. They're really good at everything, all subject areas. And maybe you're putting yourself in that top 10%. But this guy's really good. Besides grades, they also count things like following rules. So at a military academy, if you do something wrong, you get a demerit. So if you don't have your uniform ironed properly, or your buttons aren't lined up, or the brass on your buttons isn't polished, the instructors come around and give you demerits, and you lose ranking. So to be number 2 means this guy is really good. After that, he goes and fights in the Mexican-American War. He comes back. He's the director of West Point for 3 years. He's sent to D.C. to put down John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry. And then when Virginia secedes, that's when Lee decides to resign. His loyalty was to his state, his family, and the South. So the Union loses its best opportunity for a great leader. He was also married to Martha Washington's great-granddaughter. Notice it doesn't say George Washington's great-granddaughter. George didn't have any children. And there's multiple reasons that he potentially didn't have kids, but those were probably discussed earlier in the year. So his family pedigree is strong. When you've got some Washington blood in you, or at least Martha Washington blood, and your dad was a stud in the Revolutionary War,
probably fighting alongside George Washington. You've got some service in the military. You graduated at the military academy. You're already in stud land. So let's take a look at some of the strategies. The Confederacy has broken away. They've left. So their strategy is going to be defensive. Franklin, what does it mean if you're defense or defensive? You're protecting something. So if we use football as an analogy, we could use basketball, we could use any sport, and those of you that aren't sporty, I think football is probably the clearest, simplest analogy for everyone to get, even if you don't really pay much attention to sports. If you're on defense, what are you trying to protect in football? You're trying to stop the enemy, the offense, from getting into the end zone. So my back is lined up to my end zone, and my goal defensively is to stop them from moving into my territory. That's all the Confederacy is trying to do. If you come out to my house out in the middle of the country, I have set up a nail strip that you're going to run over as soon as you cross over onto my property. It's going to flatten all 4 of your tires, and you're not going to go any further. That's defensive. No, I'm not serious. That would be ridiculous and mean. Plus, the Amazon guy's at my house like every other day, so he would hate me. Guy drove through my yard the other day. I'm like, what were you doing, you doofus? Made a big old mud hole. I'm like, thanks. There's 2 days worth of work this spring when I have time. So, defensive. They're not looking for a fight. They're going to hold their ground. We might take the arsenal from the back cabinet. We're not interested in going to attack Fort Calhoun. We're defending Blair. That's been our whole goal all year. If Fort Calhoun decides to invade Blair, we're going to get the guns out of the arsenal and we're going to protect our turf. That's where Under Armour used to have a saying, we must protect this house. That was like their commercial. They'd show these guys getting in a huddle and we must protect this house. That actually was George Washington quote. He said, I'm just kidding. George Washington did not say that. They're hoping for foreign help. What's foreign mean? Yeah, far away. Other countries. Now, explain to me this. Why would any foreign country even think about helping the Confederate States of America fight against the United States of America? Really?
Because then we might see that they're helping us and think a different way about them.
Okay, so
help them later in wars.
maybe they get something from the Confederacy in return? What's the Confederate States of America have to offer to foreign countries that might be a benefit to them? Because both sides have got to benefit if they're going to fight a war together. Drugs?
No,
I don't know what you say.
jobs.
Jobs? Okay.
Yeah, the cartel.
The cartel. Think more along the lines of resources.
Oh,
What's the South really good at growing? They have a lot of cotton and a lot of tobacco. And where do the British and the French and the Spanish like to get their cotton and tobacco? From the South. So the British and the French and the Spanish might consider helping the South if it gets them a slick deal on some cotton and some tobacco. But they have to be careful about that. They're not just going to jump in and join, because if they join the Confederacy, that also means they're ticking off the Union. Now the North, the United States of America, was one of the biggest trading partners for all 3 of those places, the British, the French, and the Spanish. So if they join the Confederacy, they lose a big trading partner. So the Confederacy is hoping for intervention or help from foreign countries, but they're maybe not going to get it. The Union strategy is to invade and conquer. It's offensive. So if Fort Calhoun decides to invade, that's kind of the Union strategy. They look at Blair as ripe for the picking. There's lots of great resources here. The boys in Fort Calhoun are thinking that the girls in Blair are cuter than the girls in Fort Calhoun, so they want to attack. They want to make Blair theirs so they can have all the girls and all the resources. Girls, wasn't that nice of me to say? Yes, it was. That was a very nice compliment for me to say that the girls in Blair are cuter than the girls in Fort Calhoun. All right, then I take it all back and I say the girls in Fort Calhoun realize the boys in Blair are cuter than the boys in Fort Calhoun. There, boys, do you appreciate me at least?
Yes.
Thank you. Girls are non-appreciative. I can't believe that. I thought they would.
Yeah,
It's very nice of me to say that. So invade and conquer. They also come up with this plan. The old guy in the top right corner, you've seen him before. He's the guy that came up with the plan to defeat the Mexicans in the Mexican War, to take the Navy and float down to
That guy, he's that
Mexico
big now.
City. Yeah, he's old in this war. He's not going to do any fighting, but just because he's too old to physically fight or even physically lead a campaign of soldiers, he still has a military mind. He comes up with a plan called the Anaconda Plan. What is an anaconda?
Huge
A
snake.
snake.
A huge snake. And how does an anaconda kill its prey?
Squeeze of it.
Squeezes it to death.
And it can swallow people.
And it can what?
Swallow baby humans.
Probably a baby.
Full humans.
There was a show, and
Like, tell
this
them-
was really a pitiful show. Years ago, I think it was Discovery Channel, they had advertised it for months that this guy was going to get eaten by an anaconda. So they were looking for a 40-footer out in the jungle. I think, is it in Amazon maybe where they find anacondas? I think it's Amazon. So they're trying to find the world's biggest anaconda. They never found a 40-footer. They found like a 20-footer or something. Anyway, this guy put on this special Kevlar suit. Kevlar is bulletproof material. He had like a Kevlar helmet and Kevlar shoulder pads. And so his goal was to get eaten by a snake. Ridiculous, right? So it's like a 3-night show. And I'm watching it, and I'm like, this is going to be awesome. You're going to get eaten by a snake. He's going to first do this and wrap him up. And then when the snake detects that he has stopped moving, it's going to open up its jaw and swallow the guy. He had like cameras on his head and stuff. This is going to be great. And it gets to the last night, I'm like, it's going to happen tonight. And then they're like, oh, we didn't find the big one. So what they did is they took a little one, 20 foot, a little one,
It's a little kid.
and they laid it on the ground. And then they got this guy that goes out and starts poking it, wearing this Kevlar suit, ticking it off. And then he just lays down, so the snake starts wrapping around him. And pretty soon they've got like TV monitors and all sorts of computer monitors hooked to sensors in this dude's suit. And they're like, oh my gosh, his heart rate is going up, which that happens when you get nervous. And they're like, oh boy, they can sense the pressure that this 20-foot snake is putting on this guy. And then pretty soon the guy starts screaming like a baby girl. He's just screaming his head off. And they're like, oh, the snake is going to rip his arm off because it's pulling him apart because of the amount of strength that this big snake. So they never got to the point where the snake could try. The snake wasn't big enough to get his face around the dude's head anyway, but it literally was crushing him even with this special armor on. So an anaconda is a constrictor. It strangles its prey. So the anaconda plan is to take the Union Navy, which if we're looking at the size of the Navy, the Union had most of America's Navy, and the Confederacy had only the scraps that were left over. Take the Union Navy and blockade all of the southern ports. If the South can't get any supplies in and they can't get any supplies out, eventually they have to quit. What's another word for the Anaconda Plan that we've used all year when you don't allow anything in or out of a fortress or an area? Starts with an S. Ends with an H.
Siege.
Siege! Very good. You guys are so smart. Yeah. Is the Anaconda Plan just like a gigantic siege of an entire country? Yes, it is. Is it going to be quick and over? It doesn't really fit with that Abraham Lincoln idea of 75,000 troops for 90 days. A siege takes time. Even if Mr. Zurich somehow surrounds our room and holds us under siege, we can survive quite a while in here. It would have been better back in the old days when Randy had a big water jug. Now he's got that little one, so we're not going to be able to drink out of that. So we've got quite a bit of water here, my big old tank. And I've got those 20-year-old oatmeal cream pies in the cabinet back there that I'm sure we can eat. and I do have a package of beef jerky in my. So we could survive for days without giving up. Imagine if we had the whole school under siege and it was just the 25 of us. I would imagine that down in the cafeteria that the refrigerators are full of stuff. So we could probably, how long could we survive if it was just the school under siege?
Days.
Probably weeks, don't you think?
There's that.
If there's only 20 of us, there's enough food I'm guessing enough food in the cafeteria. They feed a couple hundred kids every day, so there's got to be enough in there for several days. If we're kind of cautious about it, if they don't shut off our electricity, it'd probably be kind of fun. We got a gym we can go play in. We got computers we can do games on. We can watch movies on the big screen. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. As long as the toilet's flush and we don't have to use the pee corner back there, everything would be fine. So the three parts of the plan were to blockade the coast using the Union Navy, control the Mississippi River, which would cut the country in half. It would cut the Confederacy in half, and capture Richmond. Richmond is the capital of the Confederate States of America. The capital starts out in Montgomery, Alabama, and then they move it to Richmond. Here's the thing. Richmond is only a few miles away from Washington, D.C. But one of the goals always of warfare is to capture the enemy's capital. When the capital falls, that usually means the enemy is near the end. Anybody ever play like a paintball or an airsoft war and you play capture the flag? You got to get the enemy's flag and bring it back to your territory. Once you've done that, the game is over. It's sort of like a man-sized warfare type game of capture the flag being the capital. Here's what the Scott, that's Winfield Scott, that's the old guy there that was in the picture. This is his plan to Anaconda the South. So there's not literally a great big snake, but if we put Union warships all along the coast, there's not enough of them to cover everything, but we don't need the whole coast. We just need to put them outside of ports like Charleston. We looked at Charleston when we talked about Fort Sumter the other day, and you're not going to put your ships in Charleston because they're going to get blown to smithereens by all of those cannon batteries that were guarding Charleston Harbor. But we put a couple of ships outside of Charleston and outside of Mobile, Alabama, and New Orleans, and we just blockade them. Any ship that tries to get in, we stop it. Any ship that tries to get out, we stop it. If they won't stop, we blow them up. The Union Navy was strong enough to do that, but it's going to take time. Let's just get through one more slide here, and then we'll be done for today. We won't even do this justice. We'll come back and revisit this on Tuesday. Tuesday. You guys are white or purple? You're white.
Yeah, we'll see.
So you'll be in my class Tuesday and Wednesday next week. So we have 2 white days in a row. I'm not sure what we'll do.
Again, another 2 hours.
Again?
Because the high school's off for state basketball on Tuesday.
Oh, yeah.
And we follow the high school schedule. I'm not sure what we'll do. We might do something else. Maybe we'll watch a video or something so that we stay on track. Anyway, let's look at some strengths. On Tuesday when we come back to this, or Wednesday, whichever day we decide to come back to this, or I decide, I've got a map that shows this even clearer. So we're going to come back and revisit this. But just to introduce it, some of the strengths of the Union, a population of about 22 million people, compared to the Confederacy, who has a much, much smaller population. About 85% of the country's factories were located in the north. Now, not all of those factories are producing war materials, but could we take a factory that's producing sewing machines and manufacture rifles instead with just some modifications? World War II is a great example of that. We have these automobile manufacturing companies like Ford and General Motors. Maybe we don't need them producing automobiles, but would it be pretty easy to take an automobile plant and make it into an aircraft plant or a tank plant or have them all build Jeeps? That's one of the things that all the rest of the world kind of took for granted, was that the United States was already geared up to produce that stuff. So even though 85% of the factories, they're not producing uniforms for soldiers and rifles for soldiers, they could be modified to do those things. And if warfare breaks out, we don't need factories producing dresses for women. So we take the dress factory and we have them produce uniforms for soldiers. Women, sorry, you're just going to have to wear the same dress for a few years until this war is over because we've got to prioritize war materials as most important. 70% of the nation's railroad. Who cares? What difference does that make? You move your materials a lot easier. If you've got to get your people, if you've got an army of 80,000 men and you need to move them, instead of marching them 60 miles, put them on the train if it's going the right direction. Trains have limited usefulness because they only go where the tracks take them, but it's a lot easier to move stuff around the country. Most of the Navy and all of the shipyards and better technology in the weapons. The strengths of the Confederacy, they have a home field advantage. They're fighting at their homes to protect their homes. So they've got the same advantage that America had in the American Revolution. If the Fort Calhounians decide to attack us, we know the territory in our neighborhoods in Blair a lot better than they do. So we're better prepared to defend them. So the Confederates are fighting at home. The battle's going to come to them most of the time. The geographical size of the South, it's huge. And we're going to see this more and more and more every day we talk about the Civil War. We already talked about Robert E. Lee probably being the best. You could argue maybe that he was number 2, but I'll give him number 1 credit of all of the generals in the Civil War. In fact, probably 3 of the top 4 generals in the Civil War were Confederate generals. So they've got better leadership, which we talked about a little bit the other day in class when we talked about the military academies and how a large percentage of the soldiers in those academies were from the South. So, are there any questions about strategy or about strengths of the Union and Confederacy? We'll look more at strengths later, and we'll also dive into the weaknesses, because sometimes strengths and weaknesses are just like opposites. Sometimes they're not. No questions? Okay. That's where we'll start back up. We'll come back to this slide and review it briefly, and we'll take a look at a map that describes it a little bit more detailed, and then we'll move on from there. And then next week, Tuesday, we should be ready for the first real battle of the Civil War, a place called Bull Run. And some kind of almost comical stuff takes place at Bull Run. It's kind of interesting / fun / weird all at the same time.